The espresso machine hissed like a viper in the corner of the 20th floor break room, its steam curling into the stale, privileged air where 4 employees lounged like predators in silk. Laughter ricocheted off the glass walls. Sharp, controlled, cruel. "Did you see her?" Megan snorted, phone half raised, the camera lingering on the back of a woman who had just walked past reception. Lips like a plastic doll, hair like she dipped it in fryer oil. More laughter. A man in tortoiseshell glasses chimed in. "She had that walk, you know, that I'm too important to be here kind of strut. Bet she's headed to customer service. Or HR. "No," came the dry reply from a third, smirking. "Janitorial." That made them cackle. One of them mimicked the sway of her hips, exaggerated and grotesque, while the others wheezed, clapping silently like seals. Megan uploaded the video to their private Slack channel. Meme room. Caption: "Corporate Barbie, 200% attitude, 0% taste." It was liked instantly. A filter was added. Big red lips, googly eyes, fake afro. They howled. No one questioned why their cruelty felt so familiar. No one wondered why it came so easy. The woman in question had spoken no more than 4 words when she walked in. "Good morning, I'm expected." But that was enough. Her skin was dark, her confidence red as arrogance, her silence as defiance. And that, in this office, this chrome and glass kingdom built on generational nepotism and curated LinkedIn smiles, was sin. They didn't notice the receptionist's eyes widening behind her computer. They didn't notice the security guard, rigid as stone. They certainly didn't notice the tiny flicker in the glass reflecting a figure watching just beyond the hallway corner. When the announcement hit the office less than an hour later, "Please welcome Ms. Ayana Rivers, the newest member of our board," the air changed. The laughter died so violently, it felt like someone had snapped a neck. Megan dropped her phone. The man in glasses went pale. The smirking one turned away, mouth twitching. Ayana walked in slowly, the sound of her heels slicing the silence. She wore no expression, no smile, no fury, just that same unreadable calm. Her eyes swept over them briefly, dismissively, like one might glance at furniture in a room you don't plan to keep. Then she took her seat at the head of the table. The predator had entered the den, and the hyenas had no idea they'd been living in a cage. By the time Ayana Rivers sat at the polished mahogany table in the executive boardroom, her nameplate already engraved and glinting under soft overhead lights, the meme room was silent. Slack notifications had dried up. Screens were minimized. Coffee mugs trembled in suddenly sweaty palms. But outside that room, where no one dared breathe too loud, a darker current still pulsed. Because while the laughter had stopped in public, in private, the ugliness clung like oil to skin. "This is what happens when they start checking diversity boxes instead of credentials," someone muttered later in the hallway, pretending to fix the lid of a water cooler. Affirmative action got a little too generous this time. She probably threatened a lawsuit if they didn't put her on the board, another whispered in the elevator, just loud enough for his friend to chuckle. She walks in like she owns the place. Typical. That word, typical, dripped from their tongues like venom. It didn't matter that her resume read like a war journal of brilliance: Harvard Law, Stanford MBA, 2 startups sold before 35, a career built brick by brutal brick. In their eyes, she hadn't earned a seat. She had taken it, stolen it, and that made her dangerous. They joked in code now, more careful, but just as cruel. "Queen of Wakanda's looking tense today," they said when she passed by. Someone should check her crown. Someone edited the video again, this time privately, added tribal drums in the background, pixelated her face into a caricature. It circulated in encrypted group chats, outside company servers. One forwarded it to another, then another. They called it satire. They called it harmless. They called it funny. But the laughter was always whispered now, nervous, afraid it might echo too far. One of them, Jared, the man in tortoiseshell glasses, started looking over his shoulder more often. His hands shook when he typed. He flinched when Ayana walked past his desk, though she never looked his way. Not once. The thing that unnerved them most wasn't rage, it was indifference. She did not call them out, did not flinch, did not stumble. She simply watched, listened, took notes. Her silence was not weakness, it was precision, a scalpel sliding across the surface of a still living thing. They had expected a show of outrage, a demand for apology. They were prepared to grovel, but she gave them nothing, and nothing, they would soon learn, can be far more terrifying than fury. She entered every room like she had been there before, like the walls remembered her footsteps even if the people inside tried to forget her face. She didn't flinch when conversations stopped mid-sentence. She didn't blink when smiles faded into tight-lipped nods. And most chilling of all, she never lifted her eyes to meet theirs. Not once, not even when they tried to force it. On Wednesday morning, the senior staff meeting was held in Conference B, the smaller glass room with the long steel table and soundproof walls. She was already there when the others walked in. Early, seated, reading, a leather-bound notebook open in front of her, pen poised, silent. One by one, they filed in, each pretending not to notice her presence, yet unable to stop glancing. Megan took a seat across from her, legs crossed tightly, the same legs that had mimicked Ayana's walk just days before. She didn't speak, neither did Ayana. Jared sat diagonally, rubbing his thumb against his phone screen, swiping back and forth over nothing. Behind him, on the glass wall, his distorted reflection looked like it was trying to escape. They talked about quarterly projections, they talked about marketing budgets, they talked about synergy, but every sentence sounded rehearsed, mechanical, because the air was thick with her silence. And then, halfway through a slide deck on regional growth metrics, Ayana turned a page in her notebook. The sound was slight, like a whisper, but it sliced through the room. Heads turned instinctively. She didn't react, just wrote something. Slowly, elegantly. One of the directors, Paul, a silver-haired man with a voice like varnish, cleared his throat and smiled too wide. "Ms. Rivers, if you have any suggestions, feel free to jump in." She didn't look up. "Not yet," she said softly, her voice smooth, almost detached. "I'm still studying the patterns." Patterns. The word lingered like smoke. Later that day, Megan found an envelope in her office mailbox. No name, no return address. Inside, a printed screenshot from the Tao meme room chat. Her own comment, lips like a plastic doll, circled in red. Just that. No note, no signature. She stared at it for 15 minutes. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Because that chat was deleted. Purged. Gone. Or so she thought. Meanwhile, Ayana moved through the halls like a ghost with weight. The janitors stood when she passed. The receptionist kept her eyes low. Even the head of HR stopped trying to make friendly small talk. Everyone felt it, that quiet, unbearable tension, like standing on thin ice and hearing a crack somewhere deep below. Still, the jokes continued, in corners, in restrooms, in cars. Maybe she thinks she's Oprah now. Board member or not, she still looks like she shops at airport kiosks. I bet she uses her notebook to write down who gets whipped next. They laughed, nervously, desperately, because the more they talked, the less they had to look at themselves. But Ayana never lifted her eyes, never asked for anything, never raised her voice. She just watched, and wrote, and waited, and slowly, quietly, made sure they knew. She saw everything. Let's pause for a brief moment. If you're still with us, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Have you ever experienced or witnessed something like this? Something that left a mark? Something that stayed with you long after it ended? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to follow so you don't miss what happens next. We continue. The first time Ayana was told to smile more, she was 11 years old, standing in the hallway of a private school she wasn't supposed to afford, wearing a uniform she ironed herself, listening to a white parent tell her, "You'd look prettier if you smiled." The second time, she was 17, top of her class, and a teacher told her to tone down her answers because the other students were intimidated. By 22, a partner at her first internship pulled her aside after a presentation and said, "You're sharp, but sometimes your tone comes off aggressive. You should soften it. Make it more approachable." Approachable. She learned what that word meant. Make yourself smaller, quieter, less proud. Make your brilliance seem accidental. Make your existence apologetic. She never did, and they never forgot it. That smile, the one she wore now, wasn't friendly. It was the smile of someone who had memorized every insult disguised as feedback, every polite dismissal, every "you people" wrapped in a joke. It was the smile of someone who'd sat silently through meetings where white men recycled her ideas and got applause for them. It was the smile of someone who had outperformed, outworked, and outlasted people who still thought they were better. But they didn't know any of that. Not yet. To them, she was just another diversity win, a box checked, a photo for the annual report. They saw her skin first, her gender second, her silence last, and assumed it meant nothing. They didn't know that behind that calm expression was a storm so old it no longer roared. It calculated. When she entered rooms, they still watched her clothes, her hair, her posture. "Bold color choice today," someone said on the elevator, eyes flicking down her crimson suit. "Very cultural." "Her earrings could double as satellite dishes," another whispered to a coworker who nodded too quickly. These weren't jokes. These were tests, traps, probes to see how much they could get away with. And every time she ignored them, they grew bolder, like children poking at fire, thinking they wouldn't get burned. But what they couldn't see, what they refused to imagine, was that she wasn't ignoring them. She was studying, tracking, recording. She knew the janitor's daughter's name. She knew who the night staff were and how they were spoken to when no executives were watching. She knew which emails weren't encrypted, which phones weren't locked. She knew who had passed over better qualified black candidates, who had deleted applications, who had jokes archived in private drives. Ayana didn't move like someone trying to fit in. She moved like someone building a case. And still, they talked. Still they laughed behind closed doors, comforted by their numbers, their titles, their legacy of impunity. But something had shifted. Some of them felt it, though they couldn't explain why the air seemed heavier when she was near, or why the lights in the hallway seemed colder when she walked past, or why silence now followed her like an echo. The smile she wore never reached her eyes. It never had to, because it wasn't a smile of peace. It was the smile of the wasp, patient, elegant, lethal. And no one noticed it was circling the hive. The days blurred together after that. Ayana's presence in the office had gone from being an odd curiosity to a quiet, seething discomfort. She moved through the halls with the grace of someone who knew their power, but never flaunted it. There was something about her stillness, about the way she walked into every room like she owned it, that unnerved them more than any outburst could have. It wasn't her silence that unsettled them. It was the fact that she had nothing to prove. For the others, it was an exhausting, self-inflicted game. They, who had lived their lives in a world that measured their worth by their proximity to power, now found themselves in the presence of someone who did not ask for validation, someone who had reached a place of authority without begging, without pandering, and worst of all, without trying to fit into the mold they had created. Megan, the one who had started it all, the cruel jokes, the mocking videos, found herself struggling to look Ayana in the eye. She had been one of the loudest voices in the break room that day, mocking the new board member with her friends, laughing at her hair, her lips, her posture. But now, every time Ayana walked by her desk, Megan's stomach turned. She could feel the weight of Ayana's gaze, though it was always calm, always composed. It was the weight of someone who knew what you had done, who saw you as nothing more than a shallow caricature. But what made it worse was the silence. Ayana said nothing, not one word. The office's tension was like a knot tightening in the pit of everyone's stomachs. But Ayana, she was unfazed. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to speak to remind them who was in control. She simply existed, and that was enough. One Friday morning, the rumors started circulating. Someone, perhaps from HR, perhaps from a disgruntled ex-employee, had leaked an anonymous document to several senior executives. It was an internal report, nothing too formal, but it carried weight. It was a carefully detailed account of the company's practices, how the hiring process had been skewed to favor white candidates, how promotions had been routinely given to the least qualified, simply because they fit the image of what the company wanted, how countless black applicants had been rejected despite having more experience, more qualifications, and better references. The document listed names, dates, and specific instances, times when emails had been erased, times when applicants had been overlooked, times when corporate leadership had made covert racist remarks, laughing off the severity of their words. The leak had come at the worst possible time. Ayana had spent the last few weeks quietly compiling her own evidence. She had known what was going on long before the report had surfaced. She had always known. But she had waited. She had let the rumors fester. She had let them call her things behind her back. She had let them make jokes at her expense. And now, with the report in hand, it was time. One by one, she began to meet with the executives. She made no threats. She gave no speeches. She didn't need to. She simply placed the document in front of them, one at a time, and waited as their eyes scanned the pages. The words in those documents weren't just an accusation. They were a mirror that reflected the ugly truth they had spent years denying. Jared, the man with the tortoiseshell glasses, was the first to crack. He had been so careful, so deliberate in hiding his true thoughts behind a polished facade. But now that he saw the undeniable evidence, the cracks in his armor began to show. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, rubbing his hands together, unable to meet her gaze. I didn't know it was that bad, he muttered, his voice faltering. I didn't know, Ayana interrupted, her voice calm, but the weight behind it was undeniable. You knew, you just didn't care. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He couldn't argue. He couldn't deny it. The proof was in front of him, laid out so plainly that it left no room for excuse. Ayana watched him for a moment longer before moving on to the next. The next was Paul, the senior director, who had always given the impression that he was untouchable, that his position in the company gave him immunity. He was a man who had thrived in an environment built on elitism, who had never been questioned, never challenged. But now, as Ayana placed the document in front of him, she saw the sweat starting to bead on his forehead. His hands trembled ever so slightly as he skimmed through the pages. He didn't speak at first. He couldn't. How could he? Every page was a blow to his ego, a blow to his carefully constructed narrative of meritocracy. He had always told himself that he had earned his place, that his success had come from hard work, from making the right choices. But now he saw the truth. His success had come from a system that rewarded his whiteness, that rewarded his gender, that rewarded his privilege. I didn't, he started, but the words faltered. His voice cracked. You didn't think you had to, Ayana replied, her tone as cold as ice. You didn't think you had to, because for people like you, the rules have always been different. You've always had a seat at the table. The tension in the room was palpable. They were cornered. There was no escape from the truth Ayana had just dropped in front of them. They had spent years building their empire on the backs of others, and now that empire was crumbling before their eyes. One by one, they would fall. By the time Ayana had seen them all, each of them, the ones who had made jokes, the ones who had sat idly by, the ones who had allowed the system to function unchecked, she knew the game was over. It was no longer about playing nice. It was no longer about keeping up appearances. The masks had come off, but it was still not enough. She had played her hand well, but this was just the beginning. She wasn't here to watch them squirm. She wasn't here for revenge. She wasn't even here for justice. She was here to dismantle the system, to tear down the very walls they had built around themselves brick by brick, and she would do it with one simple, undeniable truth. She had earned every bit of her place. They hadn't. And when she walked away from that room, her silence louder than any speech could have been, The weight of her presence was felt in every corner of that office, in every desk, in every whispered conversation. She had done more than expose them. She had shown them what true power looked like, and it wasn't the power they had assumed they held. It was hers now. In the hours following Ayana's quiet confrontations, the office had fallen into a strange kind of stillness. It was the kind of silence that stretched and choked, a suffocating weight in the air that everyone felt but no one could escape. Even the usual din of coffee machines, ringing phones, and clacking keyboards seemed muffled, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Executives scrambled to patch things up, to control the narrative before it spread too far beyond the walls of their corporate fortress. But it was already too late. Ayana had planted a seed, one that had been watered with undeniable truth. And now, it was spreading. The first inkling of the fallout came when HR summoned a meeting to discuss the leak of the internal report. They had no idea who had sent it, but they knew exactly who it had come from. There were no secrets in an office like this. And the moment the report had landed in the hands of the senior executives, it was clear that it was Ayana who had orchestrated it all. She had to be the one. It wasn't just the contents of the report itself. It was the quiet confidence with which she had confronted them. The power she had exuded without raising her voice. The tension in the office had only worsened after the meeting, and now everyone was on edge. Employees avoided each other's eyes. Conversations halted abruptly when anyone walked by. The silence was unbearable. But Ayana was unbothered. She didn't seem to notice the weight of the looks being thrown her way, nor the whispered conversations behind her back. She simply continued her work, attending meetings, contributing when needed, but mostly observing, watching, waiting. It was on a Thursday afternoon that the next phase of her plan began to unfold. Ayana had known that they were watching her, perhaps even following her. She had expected it. She had been in these rooms long enough, seen these games played so many times, that she knew exactly how they worked. When they couldn't control you through words, they tried to control you through fear. And fear, in a corporate world like this, was a weapon. So, she had turned their own weapon against them. The cameras had always been there. She had noticed them on her first day. The surveillance cameras that dotted the corners of the office, the ones in the elevators, the ones in the hallways, the ones in the bathrooms. They were everywhere, like silent sentinels, watching, recording, gathering footage that could be used as leverage. It was a well-known fact that the company had a tight grip on the narrative. Every email, every conversation, every movement was monitored. But what they hadn't counted on was Ayana's careful attention to detail. She had watched the cameras as much as they had watched her. Ayana knew that the cameras weren't just there to monitor the employees. They were also a tool for controlling them. A constant reminder that someone was always watching. Someone was always judging. But what if she could turn that surveillance on its head? It started small. She began to take note of the times when certain conversations were happening, when certain decisions were being made behind closed doors. She watched for patterns in the surveillance footage. She noticed that the cameras were often positioned in such a way that they couldn't see certain corners of the rooms, certain sections of the hallway. It was deliberate, and it was something she could use. She started showing up in places she knew she wasn't supposed to be. She would slip into the break room when the senior executives were gathered, pretending to be busy with her phone while listening to their hushed conversations. She would linger near the elevators, pretending to wait for a ride, but instead catching fragments of whispered, racist remarks that weren't meant to be heard. The worst ones were from Paul, the senior director, who had been especially dismissive of her during their one-on-one meetings. She had heard him call her a quota hire in passing, and she'd seen the way he looked at her, like she was a problem to be solved, a challenge to be overcome. But the cameras missed all of it, or so they thought. One afternoon, Ayana's curiosity got the best of her. She decided to confront the surveillance directly. Armed with her knowledge of the building's layout and the hidden blind spots in the cameras, she started leaving things for them to find. Documents, notes, emails, nothing incriminating at first, just enough to hint at the deeper rot that festered beneath the surface. She wanted them to start asking questions. She wanted them to realize that the surveillance wasn't just a tool for tracking employees. It was a tool for tracking themselves. By the time she was done, the entire office was on edge. Whispers of her game playing began circulating, but no one could prove anything. No one knew how she had done it, or why she had done it. The more they thought about it, the more they realized that the cameras weren't just there to monitor the employees. They were watching the wrong things, the wrong people. And as the rumors of the ghost in the system spread, Ayana kept moving through the halls like a shadow, smiling to herself. She wasn't trying to expose anything yet. Not directly. She was laying the groundwork for something bigger. She was letting the paranoia set in. She wanted them to feel like they were always being watched, like the walls had ears. Because, in the end, they had underestimated her. They had thought her silence was weakness, her patience a lack of conviction. But she was not their pawn to manipulate. She was playing a much longer game, and the cameras were only the beginning. The real blow came a week later, when the HR department was forced to address the leaks. The boardroom was packed with executives, their faces grim. Ayana was there, of course, sitting in the back as she always did, silent, poised, waiting. Megan was there too, along with Jared, Paul, and several other senior managers who had all been implicated by the leaked report. The HR head, a thin, sharp-eyed woman named Emily, stood at the front of the room, holding a tablet in her hand. Her voice was steady as she addressed the group. "There have been breaches in our internal security," she said, looking directly at Ayana. "It has come to our attention that someone has been manipulating the surveillance system, accessing confidential files, and leaking sensitive information to external parties. This is a serious violation of company policy." She paused, letting the words sink in. The room was tense. Ayana could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she didn't react. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. It was all part of the plan. She wasn't surprised by this. She had known they would try to pin it on her. But what they didn't know was that Ayana had covered her tracks too well. Every move she had made had been carefully calculated, and now they were playing into her hands. Emily continued, scrolling through the tablet. "We have reviewed the footage from the security cameras. We have seen what has been happening, and we are taking action." She shot a glance at the room, as if daring anyone to speak, but no one said a word. They were all too afraid, too ashamed. It was Ayana who finally broke the silence. "I think," she said, her voice calm but chilling, "that you should take a closer look at the footage. You might find something interesting." Emily blinked, clearly caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Ayana smiled, just the slightest curl of her lips. "I mean, the cameras weren't the only things being watched. There's more footage. The cameras in the hallways, the ones by the elevators, the ones you thought were just for show. You might want to check them again. I think you'll find some very interesting conversations. Conversations that were never meant to be heard." There was a pause, a long, thick moment where the room held its collective breath. And then the realization hit like a tidal wave. Ayana hadn't just used the cameras against them. She had been using them to expose their lies all along. The room fell into chaos. People scrambled to check their phones, to look up the footage she had referenced. The atmosphere shifted from one of control to one of pure panic. Emily looked down at her tablet, scrolling frantically, her fingers trembling. But Ayana? She just sat there, the weight of her silence louder than any accusation could have been. And as the room spun into disorder, Ayana knew. She had won. The game was over. The chaos in the office had reached its peak. Ayana could feel it in the air, the weight of whispers, the anxious glances exchanged in the hallways, the way the senior executives suddenly started to accidentally bump into her in the elevator, offering tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. It was no longer a question of whether they could control the narrative. It was a question of whether they could salvage anything at all. But for Ayana, this was never about salvaging anything. She wasn't interested in redemption. She wasn't interested in their apologies. She had been patient, silent, observant, and now it was time for her reckoning. She had already won. But they didn't know that yet. The meeting with HR was scheduled for the following Monday. Emily, the HR head, had made it clear in her last desperate, frantic speech that they needed to resolve this situation before it escalated further. She had been told to find a way to smooth things over, to appease the angry whispers from the board and the executives, to somehow quiet the storm that Ayana had started. They wanted her to apologize. It was a strange, surreal thing. Ayana had spent weeks, months, watching their every move, studying the cracks in the foundation of their so-called company culture. She had witnessed the covert racism, the microaggressions, the deliberate missteps to marginalize the very people they claimed to embrace. And now, they wanted her to apologize. They wanted her to fall in line, to take back the truth she had revealed, to act as though none of it mattered, to act as though she were the problem. No, she wasn't going to apologize. Not for exposing their lies, not for shining a light on their hypocrisies, and certainly not for forcing them to see the rot beneath their polished, shiny exteriors. The meeting was held in the largest conference room in the building. It was a sterile space, sleek, cold, intimidating. The kind of room designed for power plays, for manipulations, for those who had long ago learned to speak in half-truths and veiled threats. But Ayana wasn't intimidated by rooms like this. She'd spent her life in places where power was wielded in shadows, where those with privilege were given the world, while the rest of us had to claw our way up through broken systems. She entered the room alone, as always, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The faces around the table were all familiar. Megan, Jared, Paul, and the rest of the senior management team, each one trying to look composed, trying to hide the guilt in their eyes, trying to act like they had control of the situation. But the cracks were showing. She could see it in the way they shifted in their seats, the way their hands fidgeted, the way their eyes avoided hers. "Ms. Rivers," Emily began, her voice brittle, as if she were trying to hold it together for the sake of propriety. "We've called this meeting to address recent events and to discuss the steps that need to be taken to resolve the situation." She looked down at her notes, then back up at Ayana, trying to make eye contact, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "It has come to our attention that certain actions on your part have caused significant disruption within the company, and we'd like to offer an opportunity for you to explain yourself, to clarify your intentions." Ayana sat back, folding her arms in front of her. She could already hear the tone, the attempt to paint her as the instigator, the one causing chaos where there had been none. But she wasn't going to let them spin the narrative. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a defense. "I don't have anything to clarify," she said evenly, her voice smooth and unyielding. "I've said what needed to be said. You've heard everything you need to hear." Megan shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had been one of the worst offenders, no, the worst offender, in the break room, mocking Ayana's appearance, laughing behind her back. Now, she was trying to hide her discomfort by staring at her phone, pretending to type something. But Ayana knew. She knew exactly how uncomfortable Megan felt. "I think what Ms. Rivers is trying to say," Jared interrupted, his voice a little too quick, "is that the situation has escalated beyond what anyone anticipated. It's a bit much, don't you think? We're all just trying to do our jobs here. Maybe it's time for you to take a step back and reframe your approach." The way he said reframe, the patronizing tone, the subtle implication that Ayana had somehow overreacted, was almost too much for her to ignore. He thought he was being clever. He thought he was offering her a chance to crawl back into line, to beg for forgiveness, to apologize for the disruption she had caused. But she wasn't going to apologize. "No, Jared," Ayana said, her voice cool but biting. "What you're trying to say is that you want me to shut up. You want me to shrink myself, to make myself small, to let you continue living in your little bubble where nothing ever changes, where the status quo is never challenged. You want me to apologize for exposing the truth you all tried so hard to bury. Well, I'm not going to apologize for that." Paul finally spoke up, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and fear. "You're making this personal. This isn't about you. This is about the company. It's about the culture, about what we've built here, what you're doing. It's tearing us apart." His voice shook, but he tried to hide it, tried to act as though he was still in control. "You're making everyone uncomfortable." "I'm making you uncomfortable," Ayana said, her gaze unwavering. Because the truth makes you uncomfortable. Because the truth about how you've treated people like me, people who don't look like you, has always made you uncomfortable. You're used to being able to laugh at us behind our backs. You're used to having the power to destroy lives and careers without ever facing any consequences. But now, you have to face the truth. You have to look at yourselves in the mirror and admit that you've been complicit. All of you. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Ayana could see them all scrambling for a response, but they didn't have one. They had no counter-argument, no defense, no way to escape the truth. She had taken everything they had tried to hide and exposed it for the world to see. And now, there was nowhere left for them to run. Emily, looking desperate, tried to regain control. Ms. Rivers, we understand that you've had difficult experiences. We recognize that the situation has been challenging for you, but this is not the way to handle it. You need to understand that we are a company, and we need to think about the bigger picture. We need to think about our brand, our reputation, the future of the company. Ayana's laugh was cold, hollow. The bigger picture? You mean your precious brand? The one you've been lying to everyone about for years? The one you've built by sacrificing people like me, people who don't fit the mold of your so-called diversity initiatives, and then patting yourselves on the back for doing the bare minimum. They all looked away, avoiding her gaze, unwilling to confront the truth. But Ayana didn't need them to admit it. She didn't need their approval or their apologies. She had already won. I don't need to apologize for anything, Ayana said, her voice low and steady. But I'm going to give you all a chance to do something you've never done before. Something that might actually help you sleep at night. I want you to think about the people you've hurt. The ones who will never get the opportunities you've had. The ones who have been silenced and ignored for far too long. And then I want you to decide, really decide, what kind of company you want to be. Because this isn't it. She stood up then, her chair scraping against the floor as she made her way to the door. You can try to silence me. You can try to threaten me. You can even fire me. But it won't change the truth. The truth is already out there, and it's not going anywhere. With that, she walked out, leaving them behind in a room full of uncertainty, guilt, and panic. They had wanted her to apologize, but in the end, it was them who were left with nothing to say. It had been weeks since Ayana had walked out of that meeting, leaving behind a room full of shattered facades. The company had been in turmoil ever since. The executives were still scrambling to salvage whatever was left of their reputations, but it was too late. Ayana had already exposed the cracks in the foundation, and there was no amount of damage control that could fix it. The truth had already taken root, and it was spreading faster than they could contain. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of backdoor meetings, frantic calls to the PR department, and discussions about how to move past the scandal. They had tried everything: apologies issued in carefully worded press releases, internal emails, promising to do better, and public statements about growth and reflection. But nothing stuck. People weren't buying it. The silence in the office was deafening. No one spoke much to each other. No one had the nerve to make a joke. Ayana's presence loomed over them like a shadow, a constant reminder that their lies had been exposed, that they had been caught in the act. They tried to sweep it under the rug, but the stain was still there. Meanwhile, Ayana had become an enigma. She had removed herself from the public eye, staying out of company events, avoiding unnecessary interactions. It was almost as if she had disappeared. But her silence spoke louder than any words could have. She was watching them, always watching, and in her silence, there was a power that terrified them. But not everyone was content to let things settle. Megan, the woman who had led the charge in mocking Ayana, couldn't let it go. She couldn't stand the fact that Ayana had walked away from that meeting with the last word. Megan was the type of person who needed to be in control, who needed to be the one with the upper hand, and Ayana had taken that from her. Megan was one of the few who couldn't quite process the aftermath of Ayana's actions. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. It was eating away at her. The guilt, the shame, the fact that she had played such a big part in the cruelty. Megan had thought that Ayana would break down. She had expected her to fight back in the way they all assumed someone like Ayana would. Loudly, angrily, demanding attention. But instead, Ayana had taken the quiet route. She had dismantled them with precision, with a calculated silence that left them powerless. And now Megan was desperate to fix it, desperate to take back control. She needed to know if there was any way to make things right, if there was any way to patch the hole in her soul that Ayana had ripped open with the coldest of smiles. It was late one evening when Megan decided to confront Ayana. The office was nearly empty, save for a few stragglers working late, but it was the perfect time for her to have a conversation with Ayana, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness. She wasn't sure what she expected, perhaps an acknowledgement, perhaps an apology for the things that had been said, but she knew that she needed to try. She needed to fix what she had broken. Megan walked to Ayana's office. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see Ayana sitting at her desk, staring out the window. She looked so calm, so composed, like she had it all figured out. Megan hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open and stepping inside. Ayana didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge Megan's presence. She just sat there, unmoving, her eyes fixed on the city lights outside. I wanted to talk to you, Megan said, her voice trembling slightly. I know I've said things that weren't okay. I'm sorry. I didn't mean any of it. It was just a joke, you know? I never meant to hurt you. I never meant to make you feel less than. It was wrong. I was wrong. There was a long silence. Megan watched Ayana, waiting for some kind of response, but none came. Ayana remained as still as ever, her gaze unwavering, her expression unreadable. I was just trying to fit in, Megan continued, her voice growing more desperate. I didn't think it would go this far. I didn't think. You didn't think, Ayana's voice interrupted, smooth and even. That's the problem. You didn't think. None of you did. Megan took a deep breath, her throat tightening. I know now, and I'm sorry, truly sorry. Please, I don't want things to be like this between us. I want to make it right. You want to make it right, Ayana repeated, her voice growing colder. What exactly do you think you can make right, Megan? What part of this can you undo? The damage you've caused. The damage this entire system has caused. You can't undo that. You can't fix it with an apology. You can't fix it by pretending you didn't know what was happening, by pretending you didn't see the way things worked, the way you worked. Megan's face flushed. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Stop, Ayana said, finally turning to face her. Don't give me the I didn't know excuse. You didn't want to know. You were too busy making jokes about people like me. People who don't look like you. People who are other. You didn't care about the people who were hurt by your words, by your actions. You didn't care because you never had to. You lived in a world where you were safe, where your privilege protected you from the reality most of us face every day. The words stung. Megan could feel the weight of every syllable, the truth in them, but she couldn't bring herself to argue. Ayana's words had shattered her defenses, and for the first time she understood the depth of what she had done. It wasn't just about the jokes, it was about a system that had allowed people like her to stay blind to the suffering of others. A system that had made her think it was okay to laugh, to make fun, to mock, to belittle. Do you want to fix it? Ayana asked, her voice still cold but piercing. Do you really want to make it right? Then start by taking responsibility. Start by understanding that your apology is nothing more than an empty gesture. You can say sorry all you want, but until you change the way you see the world, until you recognize the privilege you've had and the harm you've caused, nothing will change. Megan stood there, silent, her mind reeling from the impact of Ayana's words. She had wanted to make things better, but Ayana had just shown her that there was no easy fix, no simple way to make up for what had been done. The damage was too deep. The wound had been cut too wide. And it wasn't just about one apology. It was about dismantling an entire system that had allowed people like her to get away with their ignorance for so long. Megan looked at Ayana, her throat tight, and nodded slowly. I understand. I really do. And I don't expect forgiveness. Not now. Maybe not ever. But I'll do better. I'll try to do better. Ayana didn't respond immediately. She just looked at Megan with a gaze that seemed to pierce right through her. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, without saying another word, Ayana turned back to her window, her back to Megan. You'll have to prove it. Megan nodded, and without another word, she turned and left. The door clicked shut behind her, and Ayana's office fell silent once again. Ayana remained at the window, looking out over the city. The lights below seemed to pulse with life, but in her mind, she was still calculating, still waiting. The battle wasn't over. It had barely begun. She had exposed them for what they were, but the real work, real change, would take time. It would take more than apologies. It would take action. And Ayana would be there, watching, waiting, until they had no choice but to change, until they had no choice but to face the truth that they could no longer ignore. The silence that had fallen over the office after Ayana's confrontation with Megan was unsettling. It wasn't just the awkwardness of that single exchange. It was the weight of the truth now hanging in the air, the realization that the game had changed. The executives and senior management team, who had once believed that their carefully curated personas and hollow apologies would appease the masses, now found themselves trapped in a growing storm that they couldn't control. No matter how many press releases they issued, no matter how many meetings they convened behind closed doors, the truth had already spread like wildfire. Employees were talking. Whispers turned into conversations that turned into full-blown arguments. The air in the office was thick with tension, with people now divided along lines that weren't just about work, but about justice, about accountability, and about the very fabric of the company's culture. Ayana had broken the dam, and the flood was unstoppable. The leadership team, once a united front, began to splinter. Megan was on edge, unable to face Ayana again after their conversation, but still desperate to prove that she could change. Jared, the man who had so arrogantly mocked Ayana in the early days, had begun showing up to work late and leaving early, avoiding anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. Paul, the senior director who had tried to downplay everything with his hollow speeches, now spent his time furiously searching through old emails, desperately trying to find any way to distance himself from the accusations. And Emily, the HR head, looked more and more like a broken doll every time Ayana walked past her. But none of them were the real issue anymore. The real issue was the people who were watching. Ayana had never been alone in this battle. She wasn't just fighting the executives. She was fighting a system that had allowed them to thrive on the backs of marginalized voices for so long. She wasn't just in the office anymore. She was everywhere. Her name was on everyone's lips, even in places where it shouldn't have been. People were watching, quietly, from the periphery. Some were afraid to speak out. Others were too tired to fight. But all of them knew the truth. They knew what Ayana had exposed. There were the cleaners who had once been invisible, their voices muted by the constant hum of the office. They had seen it all. They had heard the comments whispered under breath by the same people who pretended to be allies in public. They knew what had been said about Ayana before she even stepped into that boardroom. They saw the way the senior staff treated the maintenance crew, the way they refused to acknowledge them in the hallway, like their very existence was a nuisance. Then there were the mid-level managers, the ones who had been silenced by the weight of the hierarchy. They, too, had witnessed the quiet racism, the microaggressions that festered under the surface, hidden behind polite smiles and stiff handshakes. They had been complicit, either by staying silent or by pretending not to notice, because speaking up meant risking everything: promotions, respect, their place in the power structure. And then, of course, there were the interns, the youngest and most vulnerable of them all. They didn't have the same power, the same voice as the others. They were the most expendable, the most disposable, but they saw it too. They saw how Ayana had been treated. They saw the way the more senior staff members talked about her, the way they tried to break her down with every cruel joke and every backhanded compliment. And now they were watching her every move too. Everyone was watching, and Ayana knew it. She had always known. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't yet see, was that Ayana had a plan. She had always had a plan. Her actions weren't just about exposing the wrongs. They weren't just about making people uncomfortable. She had been quietly pulling the strings, moving the pieces into place, biding her time until the right moment arrived. And now, that moment was here. It started with an email, a simple one. It wasn't long. It wasn't complex. It was just a single line of text. The full recording of last week's HR meeting is now live on the company's intranet. Please make sure to listen before tomorrow's board meeting. It was sent to everyone. There was no explanation, no details, just that. The email hit the inboxes of the entire company, from the top-level executives down to the lowliest interns. It was impossible to ignore. It sat there, waiting, like a ticking bomb. It didn't take long before people began clicking on the link, cautiously at first, unsure of what they would hear. It didn't take long before the whispers started again, growing louder with each passing minute. The HR meeting Ayana had referred to wasn't just any meeting. It was the meeting where the leadership team had discussed how to handle the situation with her. The one where they had made jokes about her. The one where they had spoken openly about their desire to smooth things over with a token gesture and a few public apologies. The one where they had made it clear that their main concern wasn't making the company a more inclusive and just place. It was about maintaining their own positions, their own power. In the recording, their voices were clear as day. Megan's nervous laugh, Jared's dismissive tone, Paul's condescending comments, Emily's desperate attempts to shift blame onto Ayana, calling her a troublemaker and too aggressive for someone who had supposedly gotten what she wanted. The laughter, the mockery, the complete lack of understanding of what they were dealing with. It was all there, laid bare for the world to hear. And then, in the background of it all, was Ayana's voice, calm, steady, unwavering. She wasn't there physically, but her presence filled the room. Her silence spoke volumes. The executives had thought they were talking behind her back, but they had forgotten that Ayana was always a step ahead. She had planted the recording. She had made sure that it would surface at the exact right moment, when they thought they were safe, when they thought they had avoided the consequences of their actions. As the recording played, people stopped what they were doing. Conversations died, eyes widened, the whispers grew louder, and in that moment, it was clear, Ayana had won. The emails flooded in, one after another. The interns, the junior staff, the senior managers, everyone had heard it, everyone had felt the weight of their words, and no one could deny it. The board meeting the next day was a disaster. Ayana wasn't there, of course. She didn't need to be. She had already made her point. The room was full of people who could no longer hide behind their facades. They could no longer pretend that they didn't know what was happening. They could no longer claim ignorance. The truth was out in the open, and it was their truth, the one they had tried so hard to suppress. Megan was the first to crack. She had been trying to hold it together, trying to act like everything was fine, but she couldn't anymore. She stood up in the middle of the meeting, her face pale, her hands trembling. I don't know what to say, she stammered. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't. You didn't think, Ayana's voice echoed through her mind, and she knew in that moment that it was true. Megan hadn't thought. None of them had. I'm sorry, Megan whispered, and for the first time, it felt like she meant it, but it was too late. The rest of the board, one by one, began to break down. There were apologies, but they were hollow. They were meaningless. They had been caught. The lies had been exposed. The power they had built on the backs of others had been stripped away. And now there was nothing left but the truth. And the truth, Ayana knew, was always the most powerful weapon of all. As the meeting crumbled around them, Ayana sat quietly at her desk, watching the storm she had created from a distance. She didn't need to be in that room. She had already won. The dust had finally settled, but the air in the office still felt thick with something heavy. The building, once brimming with the sounds of power plays and quiet deceptions, had become eerily silent. It wasn't the same silence of emptiness, but rather the silence of a long-awaited reckoning, the kind of silence that comes after a storm, when the winds have died down but the damage remains. scattered in the wake of everything that had been exposed. Ayana stood at her desk, her back to the window, watching the city stretch out in front of her. The lights twinkled, but they no longer seemed so bright. They no longer felt like promises of a world she needed to fit into. They felt like reminders of the systems that would never change unless people like her forced them to. The boardroom was a wasteland now. The executives, those who had once held the keys to everything, were scrambling to salvage what little remained of their credibility. Megan had resigned in disgrace, though she left with no apology, only the weight of her own guilt. Jared and Paul followed suit, unable to face the fallout of their words, their actions, the broken promises they'd made not just to Ayana, but to everyone who had ever been pushed to the margins. Emily had been dismissed, and though her departure was wrapped in corporate jargon, the truth was that she had been the enabler of all the misdeeds that had taken place. The building's power structure, once solid, was crumbling, and it wasn't just about Ayana. It was about the countless others who had sat quietly in meetings, endured whispered insults, tolerated the casual cruelty of an unjust system because they had no choice. Those who had been sidelined for their race, their gender, their class, their backgrounds, all of them now saw that it wasn't just Ayana who had won. It was them. It was the collective power of those who had been told they didn't belong, didn't matter, and didn't deserve a voice. Ayana had given them all a reason to believe that the tables could be turned, that the truth could and would come to light. But there was one final piece of the puzzle Ayana had been working on, the company's future. She hadn't just exposed their wrongdoings, she had set the stage for what was to come next. The next phase of the revolution was not just about dismantling a broken system, but about building something better in its place. The emails from the anonymous whistleblowers had kept coming. The recordings of the meetings, the details of the discrimination and abuse, the proof of the systemic racism that had been woven into every corner of the company. All of it was out there, now accessible to the world. But Ayana didn't care about the headlines. She didn't care about the applause she might get from the outside world. She had never cared about the praise. This wasn't for her. It was for the people who had lived with this every day and had never been heard. It was for the ones who had been told their voices didn't matter. It was for those who had been dismissed as too emotional, too sensitive, too aggressive, because of the color of their skin, because of their gender, because of their background. Ayana hadn't just brought them to the table. She had given them the tools to speak for themselves. She had shown them that silence could be a weapon, that inaction could be the greatest form of complicity, and now they knew what to do with that knowledge. There was a final meeting, a gathering, called by the remaining board members who had survived the purge. It was a desperate attempt to hold on to what was left, to at least maintain the facade of order in the midst of chaos. They wanted Ayana's approval, her blessing, to continue with the restructuring they were planning. They needed her to sign off on their plan to fix the public relations nightmare they had created. They needed her to play the part of the compliant, grateful minority who had been given a seat at the table. But Ayana wasn't going to do that. She wasn't there to help them clean up their mess. She wasn't there to help them hide their shame behind a new diversity initiative or a polished corporate statement. She wasn't there to participate in their game anymore. The boardroom was filled with the last remnants of their power. Paul, standing at the head of the table, tried to maintain an air of authority, but it was obvious to everyone that his confidence had shattered. He was no longer the man who had silenced others with a glance or dismissed them with a condescending remark. His eyes darted nervously around the room, his voice wavering when he spoke. Jared, once the most vocal advocate for maintaining the status quo, was now a shadow of his former self, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Megan, sitting off to the side, had her face hidden behind a pile of papers, but her red eyes betrayed her. She hadn't been able to sleep for weeks, tormented by the weight of her actions. Ayana stood in the doorway, observing them for a moment. She was calm, composed. She had been prepared for this meeting in ways they could never have anticipated. She wasn't here to negotiate. She wasn't here to compromise. This was her victory, and she wasn't going to let them tarnish it. "I think you all know why I'm here," she said, her voice as cool and steady as ever. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to shout. The truth carried more weight than any screaming match could. You want me to help you fix your reputation. You want me to clean up the mess you've made, to make sure your shareholders still believe you care about diversity. You want me to be your token success story, the one who can stand up and say that you've done the right thing. Ayana's gaze swept over the room, pausing on each of them. But I'm not going to help you. Not this time. They froze. It was as if the weight of her words had hit them like a physical blow. Do you really think I don't see what you're doing? She continued. Do you think that I don't know the game you're trying to play? You've already shown the world who you really are. You can't take back the things you've said. You can't undo the harm you've caused. And you can't continue pretending that you're part of the solution when you've been the problem all along. She took a step forward, her eyes locking with Paul's. I'm done being part of your narrative. I'm done being the good minority who is supposed to sit in the corner and accept the crumbs you throw my way. You don't get to rewrite this story. I'm not here to make you feel better. I'm not here to make your company look good in the eyes of the press. You're on your own. With those words, Ayana turned and walked out of the room. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had already won. She knew that the company was beyond saving, but that was never her goal. She had come for the system, for the structures that allowed the abuses to continue unchecked. She had come for the people who had been silent for far too long. And now, they had their voices back. They had their power back. And the people who had tried to break her. They were left with nothing but the broken pieces of their own lies. The world would remember Ayana Rivers not as a victim, but as a force. A force that changed the game, that turned the tide, and that made sure the truth could no longer be hidden. They would remember her as the woman who refused to stay silent, the woman who spoke up when everyone else chose to look away. And that was the end of their show. We would love to hear your thoughts on this story. What do you think about Ayana's journey? Have you ever experienced or witnessed racism in your life? Your opinions and experiences mean a lot to us, and we truly value each and every one of you. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoyed this story. It helps us keep creating content that resonates with you. Have a wonderful day, and please, if you're still with us, leave a comment with the phrase, "The truth always comes to light." That way, we'll know you listened all the way to the end. Thank you for being part of this journey.